So my most recent book, Enforcing You, I'm actually working on the sequel, Enforcing Purpose. So if you have not read this book, you're going to want to read it so that you can get the sequel that'll be coming out this fall, Enforcing Purpose. But today, I have included a download for you so that you can take the ideas that are being spoken in this message and really personalize them. The whole purpose and the premise of this message in this book was written from the perspective of a counselor. I'm a biblical counselor, I'm a professional life coach, and I work with people on a daily basis in really trying to help them overcome the struggles and the challenges of life. Nobody wants to struggle with depression, nobody wants to struggle with anxiety, nobody wants to struggle with anger, but the reality is we struggle with those things. And there seems to be this gap between who we want to be and who we know we're designed to be and how do I get there. Like it seems like there's this big space between the reality of what I'm living and the theory of who I want to be and how I could be living. And so I spend day after day working with individuals, men, women, children, teenagers, just really giving them practical ways to really enforce truth, enforce your design, to enforce the you that you want to be to come into life. So that is the premise of the entire book, Enforcing You. Many of you are going to be getting a copy of this. If you do not have a copy of it, you can find it on Amazon. You can go to my website and you can get a copy of it so that you can become more astute on how do I enforce me. So I want you to walk away today more than just feeling inspired. I'm a motivational speaker. I'm an inspirational speaker. I'm a biblical speaker. I love to speak all over the place. But what I don't want is I don't want you to feel inspired but not empowered. I want you to walk away equipped with some real tools on how you can really bring the joy and the satisfaction into your heart and into your mind. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. The first thing I want you to do is if you have not downloaded the PDF that is coming with this recording, please download that because there are questions that are on there, spaces for you to be able to write, because I want you to really engage with this message on a personal level. So while this is a universal message, it is also a very personal message because we all have our own challenges. We all have our own thought processes that we need to work through. So let's pause for a moment, and I want you, without a real thinking, just real quick, almost kind of like a knee-jerk reaction, I want you to think about how would you define yourself? If you had to come up with like a list of 2 or 3 words, like I would define myself as confident, I would define myself as shy, I would define myself as angry. Maybe some of us really struggle with anger. I would describe myself as being dependable. I would describe myself as being a faithful person. But the reality is we all have thoughts about ourselves, about who we are. And I want you to take a moment to kind of really become self-aware of that. Then once you write down who you think you are and the way you defined yourself, I want you to think about why. How have I come up with that definition? And we're going to be talking a little bit more about definitions and how we come up with definitions. But for this segment, I want you to really think about becoming self-aware. Self-awareness is one of the #1 predictors of success. The more self-aware we can be in a moment, aware of what I'm feeling, what I'm thinking, why am I feeling it, why am I thinking it, is the ability to capture that moment so that I can navigate that moment with wisdom, no matter what situation I'm in. And we're going to be talking a lot more about that as well. So I have 45 minutes to cram an entire book in. So I want to get as much out as I can. But again, this is all in the book. And there are a lot of practices, things that practical conversations, prayers, ways to declare things in your life in the book. So again, I am not trying to sell or promote my book, but I am trying to get the message out there because I've had so many incredible responses of people getting healed and getting set free. So let's think about this word definitions. The purpose of a definition is to clearly define something. We look at words and we want to understand them. So we put them in context and we put them in a sentence so that we can try to understand what a word means. But the opposite is true as well. If we don't have a clear definition of a particular word, it can change the entire context of what is being said. So I say that to say, because when we define something, we're wanting to know, what is it? How would we describe it? The actual definition of the word definition is, if you define something, you show, describe, or state clearly what it is and what it is like. So when we describe ourselves, or when we come up with a definition of who we are in a particular moment, remember that if I change the definition of a word, I can change the entire context of the paragraph. It can change the way I'm hearing something. It can change the way I perceive something. It can change the way I understand the entire sentence just by shifting the definition of a particular word. So I say all that to say that we're going to be talking about trying to shift your definition, the way you see yourself today, into a more perfectly you, the design that God has created for you, so that it can begin to shift the entire context of your life. It can begin to shift the entire context of a particular situation, who I want to be in this moment. So this is part of what we're going to be talking about. So I talked about that moment where you ask yourself, how would I define myself? If you have not done that, take a moment to do that now. Define yourself, ask yourself why. How did I come up with that definition? Now let me share with you, I spent a lot of my life moving around and I learned different rules from different cultures. Meaning, if you live in one state, this is kind of what is the rule for that state in order to fit in. If you live in a different state, you live, like I recently just learned that if you are in downtown Fort Worth, you're not really supposed to honk at people. That's, if you're in the car, you're not supposed to honk at people. That's considered rude. But if you shift over into Dallas, it's a completely different culture. People are honking at each other all day long. And so in some regard, every culture, every circumstance, every season that you go to and go through comes with a different set of rules that tries to define you, that says this is who you need to be in order to be accepted, to be liked, to be loved. Every place we go, it's a culture, and a culture brings rules that tries to define this is who you need to be. I've been able to speak a message called Sought After for several years, and it talks a lot about, I do a slideshow of all the different things that would define a woman as beautiful. So I might say, like in different cultures, it's considered beautiful to have large hips and a large back end. In some cultures, it's considered heavy. You're heavy if you have a larger rump or wider hips. So in America, we have, it's cultural to shave your legs and shave your armpits. In some cultures, they've never shaved their legs. They've never shaved their armpits. And so we have learned over the years to adhere to certain rules, and those rules begin to define us. And in some regard, we become trapped or captivated by those rules. So let's shift for a moment, and I want to talk about system plus experience. I want to talk to you about this word system. Your system plus your experience equals your core beliefs. Now, if you have a piece of paper and pencil, I want you to write that down. Your system plus your experience equals your core beliefs. Now, when I'm talking about core beliefs, for the sake of this message, I want you to think about core beliefs, meaning, what do I believe about me? I'm not talking about core beliefs. What do I believe about politics? What do I believe about religion? I want us to really think about my core beliefs about me. What do I believe about who I am? Okay, so how did we come to these beliefs? Well, the answer is in your system and your experiences. The Bible says in Colossians 2:8, I'm going to read it to you in the Passion Translation. It says, beware that no one distracts you or intimidates you in their attempt to lead you away from your fullness in Christ by pretending to be full of wisdom when they're filled with endless arguments of human logic. For they operate with humanistic and clouded judgments based on the mindset of the world system. Now, we just talked about the culture, the systems of the world, and how they try to teach and train us the proper ways to behave or who we need to be in a particular moment in order to get love, to be accepted, to be liked. But the Bible goes on and it says, they do not base their judgments on the anointed truths of Jesus Christ. So this entire book has been written based on the premise that we all believe that we're created in the image of God. Whether or not you believe that, the reality is there is a perfectly you that we are all have a biological drive to attain. We all have an innate sense of there's a more excellent form of who I could be and who I should be and that I want to live up to be. Again, this is about filling that gap, asking myself in a moment, who do I want to be? Who could I be? And then how do I become that person? So we're talking about the system. Now, when I say your system, I'm talking about the way you were raised, the home that you were raised in, the influence of your teachers or your educational system, the influence of the church or the religion that you were raised under, the influence of all the relationships that you have. We all have what we call your system, and your system has developed for you a set of core beliefs. Your system has navigated you and taught and trained you how to be who you are today. The problem is a lot of our systems are broken. And so I like to tell people that everybody has a belief system. And for short, I like to call that your BS, because a lot of times your belief system is BS. And so we've been navigated a lot of times by a broken system. A lot of us had a broken upbringing. A lot of us have unhealthy relationships in our past. Some of us may have unhealthy relationships now still that we feel stuck in or we're being victimized by. So your system is really super important. And I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about taking some time to really define your system and the definitions that came from the people in your system. Now let's talk about experience for a minute. So when I say experience, the word experience means the process of getting knowledge by doing, seeing, or feeling things, or something that happens that has an effect on you. Okay, so we gain knowledge from experience. We also develop emotional and relational habits because of experience. That's the whole premise behind PTSD. When we're dealing with somebody with PTSD, they experienced an event in their life that spoke a message to them. And when they come into an event that has similar type circumstances, that message immediately rises back up and they experience the trauma of all of the emotions, of all of the messages, of all that was happening in that moment. Even if it's completely different, all they have to have is like events, similar smells, similar interactions, that emotion immediately comes rushing up, and their emotion and their mind tells them that they are exactly where they were, even when they're not. So this is the power of our thoughts and the power of our emotions to actually cause us to experience something that isn't really true in a moment. So I can experience rejection when I'm not being rejected. I can experience and feel lonely, which might tell me nobody wants to be with you. Nobody wants to hear you. Nobody thinks you're important. You are insignificant. I can experience all of that in a room full of people. I can experience that in the middle of a conversation with my husband, y'all, because there are times when my own core beliefs of feeling like I'm insignificant begins to dictate what I'm experiencing in a moment, even if it's not true. All right, so we're talking about your system plus your experience equals your core beliefs. So how did I come to, let's say I struggle with this core belief of I'm rejected or I'm insignificant. How did I come to that place here as a 47-year-old woman? Because of my system and my experience. I've been taken captive. If you remember that Colossians 2:8, do not be taken captive. Make sure that you're not distracted or intimidated or led astray by the system and your experience and the BS that they have established in your life. So I want you to take a moment to consider this. Again, reflecting back to that PDF that you have, I want you to take a moment and I want you to ask yourself, how would you describe your dad, your mom, your family structure, your education, your culture, your religious upbringing? How would you describe those things? And what message did each one of these speak to you? Now, by coming up with how I would define the things of my past, so we're talking about your mom, your dad, especially as a child, if you were to define how was my dad when I was young, how was my mom, maybe your dad was absent. Okay, so when I say what kind of a message does he speak to you, if I say I define my dad as absent, that might speak a message to me that says I'm not worth staying for. I'm not worth being around. I have no value as a daughter. And whether you recognize it or not, that message will begin to navigate and determine every interaction that you have in the way that you live your life. And that's what we're talking about, being set free from some of the BS that is actually lying to us. A couple of months ago, I was able to speak a message that was called, If You Were Living a Lie, Would You Want to Know? And is very powerful in talking about how a lot of us don't know what we don't know. And I am hoping and praying that today you begin to discover things that you don't know you don't know. Maybe you don't know you have this BS going on in your mind that I'm rejected, I'm insignificant. And what you don't realize is that's navigating you becoming defensive in an interaction with your coworkers, or you feel like nobody is paying attention to you. A lot of our things, emotions that we struggle with in a moment go back to that core belief, most of the time the core lie that we struggle with that keeps us from really experiencing what is true in a moment. So going on, it says, how does your system play into the definitions that you came up with earlier? So you should have answered that question, how would I define me, by the time you get to this part of the PDF. So what we might find, what we usually find, is your system has played a part in helping you come up with that, how would I define myself? All right, so you want to consider some of your greatest experiences in life. Now we're looking at experiences now. What message did those experiences speak to you? What kind of a message did they leave? So also you want to do that with your worst experiences, taking a look at your worst experiences and saying, what kind of a message did this speak to me? Again, going back to maybe your mom and dad had a divorce. And that would speak a message. So if you had to write down a message, if I could teach you anything in this 45 minutes, I want you to learn how to understand that every circumstance, every emotion you have is speaking a message. And you have to ask yourself, do I agree and will I receive this message? Or will I rebuke it and say, no, message, that is a lie because God says this about me. Or because this is who I really want to be and who I'm designed to be. That's the power that we have to take authority over our thought process. But before I can navigate my thoughts, I have to define what's the message that's being spoken to me in this. If you find yourself struggling with anger a lot, ask yourself, what message am I hearing in that? Sometimes I work with husbands and wives. If a husband tends to be angry a lot, when we define that message, a lot of times it comes back to, I just feel like you're not respecting me in a moment. I feel like when you do that, you're saying, I don't honor you. And when we're able to define that, and the wife is able to say, oh my gosh, that's not at all how I feel. That's not at all what I'm trying to say. Then we're able to attack that core lie. Now, taking it a step further, a lot of times a man's going to feel that way because he already feels dishonor within himself. Maybe his father didn't honor him. Maybe he doesn't feel honored in the workplace. Maybe he just doesn't honor himself. He doesn't respect his own gifts, his own strengths, who he is as a person. And he is perceiving all that rejection, perceiving that dishonor, that disrespect because of what's going on inside of him. So I want you to go through all those PDF questions and spend some time really making sure you personalize this message. Again, if you haven't gotten the book is going to break all these down. Y'all, I just whipped through the first 4 chapters, almost 5 chapters of this book. So let's go on to the next section in talking about the power of your core beliefs. So there is a power to your core beliefs. I've already kind of given you some examples of how your core belief has power in your life. But this entire book was written on this phrase. And I'm going to put this in the PDF so that you can have it and you can see it. But get the book because it's going to break it down. Your core beliefs predetermine how you perceive, what your perspective is, and ultimately what your paradigm will become. Okay, I'm going to say that again. Your core beliefs predetermine how you perceive, what your perspective is, and ultimately the paradigm or the reality or the pattern you will start walking in. All right, so let's break that down. What is the definition of perception? Perception is, by definition, the ability to see, hear, or become aware of something through your senses. Okay, this is important. It is awareness of something through the senses. It is a neurophysiological process, including memory, by which an organism becomes aware of and interprets external stimuli through the senses. Now, the important thing for you to understand about perception is that it involves your senses, meaning I'm experiencing something, but I'm going to filter it through what I'm sensing, and it shifts and becomes my truth as it shifts through what I'm sensing. So what happens if I sense or am feeling or having a day where I'm struggling with rejection? I'm feeling depressed because my husband didn't pay attention to me this morning. I recognize that I'm feeling rejection. What I will begin to understand when I become self-aware of that is every interaction I have that day, if I'm not intentional to recognize that I already am struggling with this core belief, I will perceive rejection even when I'm not being rejected. Because what I'm experiencing is being filtered through my senses in that moment, the way I feel, so your senses is talking about, like in some regard, your emotional senses, what I'm sensing. So when I'm interacting with a husband and a wife, when I'm interacting with our residents in our shelter, and they're talking to me about what happened, and they're saying, well, this is what happened, I will often correct them and I will say, well, it's what you perceived happen. Okay? So that lets you know that there is a perception. Everybody has different perceptions. Now, it's kind of like deja vu, which is the feeling of having already experienced the present situation. Again, it's very highly sensual. Previous experiences can actually be jading to the reality of a current experience because of your emotions. Again, that's that PTSD. If I was abused in past relationships, if my husband even raises his voice, oh my gosh, I am perceiving abuse in that moment because my emotions are jading my reality, okay? So let's talk about perspective, because remember I said your core beliefs predetermine how you perceive. All right, so my core belief has already predetermined how I'm going to perceive my interaction with you based on how I'm feeling in the moment. If I'm having a grouchy day, I end up having a lot of crappy interactions. Have you ever noticed that? And sometimes we have to step back and say, wait, what's the common denominator here? I'm the common denominator. So perspective is, while perception is how I see something, perspective is what I see. By definition, it is your point of view, okay? So everybody has a point of view, and we all know that your point of view is right. Unfortunately, you may be having an interaction with somebody else who has a point of view and they also think their point of view is right. This obviously leads to a lot of conflict. But let's be honest, if I were to position one person in this corner of this room, and I was to position somebody in that corner of this room, and there was a fight that took place right in the middle of the room, this person would come to me and they would say, this was my perspective of what happened. And she sees this person's face and says, she was angry, she was cussing, she was the aggressor, okay? This person on this side of the room sees the other person's face and says, no, 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 I was standing there, I saw it, it was her face, she was the aggressor, she was the one who was cussing, she was saying all of these things. Now, which one of these points of views is right? They're both right. They're just from different points of view. That's what we're talking about in a perspective. So remember, how I perceive and what my perspective is begins to jade what I walk away with. Okay? So my core beliefs predetermine what my perspective is a lot of times. So again, if my core belief is rejection, I keep using rejection, y'all. You want to know why? Because most women struggle with rejection. We struggle with not feeling significant in moments, not feeling significant in the workplace, not feeling significant in our culture. That's the whole reason why we go to social media and we want all those likes and we want people to comment, because I want to feel and be significant. I don't want my post to be rejected. I'm just keeping it real. And so your core beliefs predetermine how you perceive what your perspective is, ultimately the paradigm you walk in. Of course, we know your paradigm is the pattern that you now live in, or your reality. So let me break it down. If I struggle with rejection, I'm going to perceive rejection. My perspective is always, I'm rejected. That person rejected me, okay? Then I begin to walk in that paradigm. It becomes it becomes the reality of my life. So I begin to walk in the pattern of rejection. We all know that girl. We all know that girl that's high maintenance, and no matter what you say, no matter what you do, she gets offended, she gets hurt. And what happens is, when I walk in that pattern, I now inadvertently teach and train people how to treat me. Have you ever noticed that somebody goes from one toxic relationship to the next? Because in their mind, they have already determined that they are worthy of toxicity. They're not worthy to be loved the way they're designed to be loved. This is all about my third book is To Love and to Be Loved. It's all about healthy relationships. So we teach and train people how to treat us. People start treating us that way. And wada bing, that becomes our reality, which now confirms what? Our BS, which is I am rejected. I am insignificant. I am fill in the blank. All right. I'm going super fast because I want you to get nuggets of this message. Again, the details are in the book. You can also do the entire online workshop. It's a 3 to 4 hour workshop on my website. If you are like, oh my gosh, this is like a fire hose just coming at me, it's because it is a fire hose coming at you, because I want you to get this. All right, so your next activity is to think about, how does the pattern that you live differ from the promises of God in your life? Now, if you're not at a place where you really have a strong relationship with God, or you don't know, or you don't believe in God, or you're not sure what are the promises of God, you can say, how does the reality of my life, or the pattern of my life, differ from who I want to be? And that excellent me that I sense inside of me, the person I really want to be. One of the most powerful questions you can learn to ask yourself in every moment is, who do I want to be right now? Do I want to be angry? Do I want to be depressed? Do I want to be ugly? Do I want to be that person who is high maintenance? Who do I want to be? I ask a lot of my clients who are like, I'm just depressed, I'm just depressed, I'm just depressed. And I will say, is that how you want to feel? Is that who you want to be? You want to know why I asked that question? Because at the core, a lot of times we become addicted to our own dysfunction. And the first step to being delivered from our dysfunction is we have to want to be delivered. A lot of us are holding on to depression. We're holding on to rejection. We think those things are holding on to us, but we are actually holding on to it because we're not willing to let it go. A lot of times that's the case because we don't know. We don't realize that I'm living less than my perfectly me, the perfection of who I could be, the most excellent Lisa. I want to have those things revealed. If you want to listen to that message, you can subscribe to my podcast. Just Google it. It'll come up. Go to my website. You can find it. But let's go to the next section and talking about reversing the cycle. So how do we reverse the cycle? Let's say we've now gone through all of these steps. You're reading the book, you're following along, and you're like, oh my gosh, that's me. I struggle with rejection. How do I stop feeling rejected? How do I stop thinking those things? There's a verse in the Bible in Romans 12:12 that says, be ye not conformed any longer to the pattern of the world, but be ye transformed by the renewal of your mind, okay? So we're talking about, again, the pattern, that system, and the experience. And some of these patterns have been developed for us, and some of the patterns we have developed, we call them coping mechanisms, triggered reactions, those kinds of things that we have developed in order to survive any particular moment. But the reality is, we have the power, whether you believe in the biblical premises or you believe it scientifically, we have the power to change our mind. We have the power to renew the way we think, the way we feel, the way we define ourselves. So the first thing you need to do is recognize, I can change. I can change my core beliefs about me. I have to want to change. I have to recognize these are the lies that are keeping me from being that excellent me, the perfectly me that I want to be. I have to recognize that and I have to want to change. So I'm going to use this example because I think it's a great example. It's about the woman at the well in John chapter 4. And I'm going to use it as an example just because I think it brings everything that we've talked about home. So the woman at the well, she goes to the well at noon, and we know as we read on, it's the longest conversation recorded in the Bible, which, by the way, was with a woman. So Jesus had this conversation with this woman. She'd gone to the well at noon. We find out that she was an adulteress, but she goes to the well at noon when nobody else is there. Okay, so we can assume that this woman is struggling with rejection. She's mocked by the world. The world has defined her as worthless, invaluable, an adulterer. And so we know that she already has that mentality when she goes to the well. Now, I think it's important for us to recognize when Jesus begins to speak to her at the well, one of the first things she says is, why are you, a Jewish man, speaking to me, a Samaritan woman? Now, what is she trying to do? She's trying to teach and train Jesus how to treat her in that moment. She is saying, don't you know that culture has given us rules, and culture says you should not be talking to me right now, okay? But Jesus shatters that culture. He brings into a new culture of love. He begins to interact with her, and he goes after the jugular. He really goes after the deep wound in her heart, which is rejection. He says to her, go and tell your husband. She says, I have no husband. He says, I know. It's true that you've lived with all of these men. You've had all of these husbands, and the man you're now living with is not married. You're not married to. Now, in the culture of that time, only men had the power to marry and divorce. So what we know is this was a very rejected woman. She had been divorced by X amount of men, and now the man she was living with was not, for whatever reason, was not willing to marry her. So she comes to the well at a time frame when nobody else is going to see her because she has isolated herself from society because of her rejection. So she has this interaction. Jesus pierces and penetrates her existing paradigm, okay? So her core beliefs. The world had established a belief system about how she saw herself. Jesus injects himself in there and he shifts, he transforms, and he reverses that cycle. And he says, basically, the world has defined for you who you are and how you should behave, what is acceptable. But as culture changers, Jesus injects himself in there and he shifts the way she sees herself. She begins to no longer see herself according to the culture, but she begins to see herself according to the love that she's experiencing in that moment. And in that moment, she has a transformation of her mind. Not just the way she saw culture, but most importantly, the way she viewed herself. The outcome is she goes back to Samaria and begins to speak to the entire town of Samaria about her greatest point of guilt and shame. Come and meet the man who told me everything about me, who knew everything about me. She was set free in that moment from all of that guilt, that shame, that rejection, that condemnation of feeling like she had no value, to the point where she said, culture, you don't get to influence me anymore, but I have become confident in who I am, and I get to influence you. I'm going to say that again, because we ladies are designed not to be influenced by the world. We are designed to be influencers in the world. That will be part 4 of this whole series. The first one will be discovering you, enforcing purpose, and influencing cultures. Because we are designed to be culture influencers. But in order to do that, we need to pull back from the influence, that system and that experience and the message that it has spoken to us. We need to tuck ourselves in and reconcile who do I believe that I am and the confidence that I have in Christ. Now, to the same degree that you are confident in who you are will be the same degree that you are courageous in a moment. So the amount of courage that you have to take a stand, to say the thing, to have an opinion when it's counterintuitive to the opinion in the room, will totally depend on how confident you are in the way you view yourself. So how do I change that mindset? So I want to hurry because I'm watching the clock here, but I want to talk to you about widening the gap between something that happens and my triggered reaction, okay? So a habit is formed because you have a stimulus, an activity, and a reward. I feel nervous, I have a cigarette, I feel better, okay? So that's a real quick description of how a habit is formed. Well, we have habitual emotions and habitual thoughts. Because something happens and when I skip that thought process in between and it goes immediately to the action, we called it a triggered reaction, and we've lost the gap or the space to capture that moment and say, wait a minute, stop, pause, time out. I want to take a breath. I want to think about what just happened, and I want to think about how I want to respond. Who do I want to be? So I have no idea where I'm at in my notes, and I'm totally good with that. Again, follow along in the PDF as you go through. There's questions there to really take this message and hit it home with you. So I want to talk to you about intentional processing. So when I'm talking about creating that space, I'm talking about creating that gap, widening the gap in my thought process. I don't have to respond angry. I don't have to be depressed. I don't have to defend myself in a moment. I get to capture the moment, create space, and have an intentional response. Not just outward response, but response emotionally. I'm not talking about faking it. I'm talking about really changing the way I think about things. So I want you to think about these 5 words: define, identify, decide, declare, and do. Okay, so define, identify, decide, declare, and do. In every situation, this is my greatest counseling tip. I have come up with these 5 words from years of experience of counseling and life coaching. And when we can define in a moment, what am I thinking? How am I feeling? Define. I do this with students when I go into schools. I will say, okay, I want everybody to close your eyes for a moment, and I want you to think about, what are you feeling right now? And it's amazing to me how a lot of the at-risk students don't know what they're feeling. And they don't know because they have detached emotionally, because that is their coping mechanism. So the first thing we need to do is we need to get back in touch with me. I need to get back in touch and define what am I feeling in a moment. All right? So a lot of times I will use emojis. I'll ask students, like, if you were to send an emoji right now, which emoji would you send? Because I'm helping them define what am I feeling. Now, once I've defined how I'm feeling, which by the way can be the most difficult process. We have all experienced that moment where you're like, ah, and you have all this jumbo, numbo, whatever. People come into my counseling room and they're just verbally word vomiting. And I will say, okay, if you had to sum it up in 1 or 2 words, the strongest emotion you're feeling right now, what would you say your emotion is? Okay, so that's step number 1, learning how in a moment to define what you're feeling. Step number 2 is identify the message behind that emotion. All right, so our emotions are road signs. They simply navigate us to a destiny. A lot of times, if I am traveling somewhere, I'm following a road sign that's going to take me to a destiny. I'm not going to get out and look at that road sign, circle around that road sign, hang out in that road sign, sit by the road sign, make sure everybody knows my road sign. When we do that, we are sitting in our emotion instead of allowing our emotion to navigate us to the message. I am looking for, why am I feeling angry? What am I hearing this person say to me right now? What in my anxiety? What is the message behind my anxiety? Oh, I'm afraid of this. I'm afraid of that. When you are able to identify the message behind your emotion, you will likely discover your core lie. We all have a core lie. I have a core lie. You have a core lie. When you discover your core lie, you will begin to become aware of how often that core lie predetermines how you perceive things, what your perspective is, and ultimately who you are, the paradigm that you walk in. Step 3, decide. I have to decide in that moment, is this true? Is this message who I want to be? Now listen to me, because your reality could be really rejection. But just because I'm walking through rejection or I'm being rejected by a person does not mean I am rejected. Okay? So when we're talking about those I am statements, the feeler should not become the feeling. The thinker should not become the thought. Do not let your feelings become I am statements. Okay? That is the power to decide in that moment, reality, I'm experiencing rejection. My message says, you're rejectable, but I am deciding I am not rejectable. I am changing my mind, y'all. This is the most powerful step, okay? These 5 things are the meat of this message of how do I change my mind about how I see myself. Then we're going to declare. Now, I use scriptures to come up with my declaration statements. In the book, I give you lots of examples of a verse, a declaration, and how do I self-reconcile that truth. If you aren't familiar with scripture or you don't believe in scripture, that's between you and the Lord. But you can still come up with a declarative statement that speaks what is true about who you want to be. I am confident. I am strong. I am sure. I am loved. I am a lovable being. I am not rejected. So you come up with declarative statements and you begin to declare those. Now, when I have identified that core lie, I don't want to wait till I'm experiencing to declare things. I want to proactively declare these truths. Why? Because I'm trying to reprogram my mind. I'm trying to re-brainwash myself with what's true and what I want for my life. And the final one is do, meaning I'm going to add to that declaration, I'm going to add to that truth an action that says, this is now who I am. So when I do what I say, so if I declare, I am not rejected, I am lovable, to act on that means I'm not going to act in rejection. I am going to behave as if this person just loved me well, even though they didn't. I am going to behave according to who I want to be, not according to what is happening. That's the action part. So I'm teaching and training my mind, but I'm adding to my thoughts an action in order for it to become my reality. That's how we pull what I know to be true and what I'm experiencing into reality. I do that by adding that action. Without the action, it'll just be thoughts. You pull that action into the reality, that thought into the reality of who you want to be by adding that action. It's a very, very, very important step. So we have come to the end of our 45 minutes. I have given you a lot of information. If you have questions, if you're not sure of something, if you can't identify your core lie, please reach out to me. I believe they're probably going to put my website on this video. I don't know. My website is www.lisa-schwarz.com. There's no T in my last name, y'all. Look me up, find me, reach out to me. I want to help you walk through this process. If this has kind of brought some stuff up that you didn't know, and you want to now deal with those things, please reach out to me. I would love to interact with you. I would also love to hear your feedback. If you buy a book, please write a review. Go to my website, see all the things that are being offered. I want this message, this entire conference, to be a trajectory for you that pushes you into the perfectly you.